Hey, Sally, I can see you.
Can you hear me as well? I hope my mic is on. Okay, perfect.
Yep. Hello and good morning to wherever you are in the world, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you find yourself. My name is Gillian Tett. I'm with the Financial Times newspaper. And speaking as a journalist, this was a year when we really woke up and discovered that risk is a four-letter word, to use the English tag. We have seen risks exploding in many, many parts of the world and our lives and affecting us all. But the question of how we evaluate risks, how we prioritize them, what people around the world are thinking is more important than ever before. So what we're going to be doing in the next hour is hearing from AXA, who have created its annual risk report together with partners from Eurasia Group and Ipsos about what people are seeing in terms of the risks they're really worried about and how that's changed from previous years and how it varies around the world. We have a great lineup of people to talk about this with us. Thomas Buberl, who is the CEO of AXA, Ian Bremmer, CEO of Eurasia Group and G0 Media President, Henri Wallad, who is the chairman of Ipsos France, René Guidet, who is the AXA Chief Risks Officer, Sally Wan, who's joining us live from Hong Kong, who is the CEO of the Hong Kong entity for AXA, Ulrike Decoene, who is the AXA Head of Communications, and Gérard But, who is the Eurasia Group Vice Chairman and Senior Advisor. So voices from all over the world, different perspectives, and hopefully a chance for us to hear what risk is, how risk is being viewed around the world. Now, for this survey, apparently there were 2,700 risk experts from over 54 countries contributed to it, 20,000 people from the general public. I would love to know how you reach that many people at a time of lockdown and COVID, but maybe we can hear about that in a moment. And people were asked about the evolution of emerging risks over the next 5 to 10 years and asked to really rank it in terms of the top 10 emerging risks. So to explain how and why this study was done and what the key messages were, I'd like to start by asking Thomas Buberl, who's the CEO of the insurance company AXA, which protects against risk, and so they need to price it in particular, what you found out about this year's survey, what surprised you, what didn't surprise you, and what the key lessons are.
Thank you, Gillian, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. This is the 7th edition of the AXA Risk Report, so we have some history to see how risks are evolving over time. And this year was a year of a lot of surprises and non-surprises. What are the key takeaways? Number one is the risk of health and pandemic has clearly made it to the first place as being seen as the most important risk. This is certainly colored by the fact that we have all gone and are still going through the tragic moments of the pandemics of COVID-19. And so risk is really at the top forefront, health is really at the top forefront of every company, of every individual. Lesson number two is that the climate risk that used to be for a long time on position number one has now been pushed to the second place. I would classify this as probably a very temporary phenomenon, since, to my mind, the climate risk should still remain the number one risk, because it is the origin of many of the risks that we see today. So pandemics can certainly find a lot of its origin as well in the climate risk. And certainly when we look more longer term, we do believe, and we've also seen it, that in some of the geographies, the climate risk was much more present than the pandemic risk, that this remains a very important risk for the long term. The third lesson we have drawn, and that has already been the case last year, that these risks over time have changed in its nature. They used to be very independent risks, but over time they have become far more dependent. So the interlinkages and the influences amongst each other have been increasing over time, and this is certainly something to consider when we think about solutions of these risks, since they are now far more complex to solve and to provide answers for. Two risks which I would like to highlight that are also on the top ranking and that will probably play a more important role going forward. One is clearly the geopolitical risk. We've seen that this is clearly coming more and more forward. Not only the question around geopolitical risk between the US and China, but there are also other actors now on the scene, like Turkey, like Russia, and this complex will become far more complex. And secondly, and that's a risk that will probably rise as we go more towards 2025, is the risk of social fragmentation. We see that climate risk, pandemic risk, wears heavily on the question, how can we really keep societies together? How can we make sure that social justice is still worth and is still be there for the future? And I do believe that our society will be put to a significant test going forward when it comes to social cohesion and those social risks. All of this is in a context in which risks have increased. So when you look at pandemic risk, when you look at environmental risks, these are not risks that we have known for 20 years. These are really new risks. I mean, for a pandemic, yes, on the health side, we've known that people became ill, but this was maybe 1 person out of 10. And as an insurer, you could always make sure that you helped the 1 person out of 10. If 10 out of 10 are ill and affected by a much larger systemic risk, new solutions need to be provided, and those solutions are clearly solutions that have to be created as a combination of private actors and of state actors. All of this is happening in an environment in which the risk tolerance is decreasing. So the equation remains very difficult. New risks and more risks, more interdependence of the risks, and less tolerance for these risks. So it will be very interesting to see how we all together make sure that we contribute well enough to the solution of these very difficult risks.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. Very thoughtful. Very briefly, before I throw to Ian, I'd like to quickly ask, are you seeing this concern spread right across the world? Because it used to be the case that social cohesion was an issue more for emerging markets than the developed world. Is it a geographic phenomena, global phenomena?
We see it everywhere today. And in particular, I do believe that the consequences of COVID-19 will be far more severe in the emerging markets than they are in the developed markets so far, because the developed markets obviously have the fiscal means, the monetary means to smooth a period of significant crisis, whereas we've seen in many emerging markets that the same means are not there. So the danger of people falling back into poverty is certainly much higher in those emerging markets. So you have the risk there as well. And when you look into the developed markets, it is clear that state actors have at the moment still sufficient fiscal means in order to help bridge a very difficult situation. But if you imagine yourself, more risks could happen, more pandemics could happen. At some point, these actors will run out of the sufficient means in terms of debt, in terms of monetary mass. And at some point, we also have to think about who is paying back all of this. And when you look today in the developed markets, these points were heavily on the question of social cohesion.
Right. I just mentioned that because the world used to be divided into emerging markets and developing markets, and many investors assumed that emerging markets was where you found political risk and developing markets was where you didn't for the most part. And that clearly is now changing as social cohesion issues come to the fore. But I'd like to bring in somebody at this point who is an absolute expert on political risk, been writing about it for years, and in many ways, his work is now more relevant than ever before, which is Ian. Ian, is there anything that you, from your position in the Eurasia Group, find surprising about this report? And what to you are the key elements that we should be focusing on?
Well, I'm certainly not surprised that the survey shows that people are paying more attention to a pandemic as the #1 risk right now. I mean, it's a future risks report. But surveys frequently show where we've been as opposed to where we're going. The analysis, having said that, is very much oriented towards the future. And there are some bits that are surprising. It's just how much acceleration you're seeing in trends that we've been talking about, both AXA and Eurasia Group, for years together now, but you're experiencing 5-10 years of acceleration of a risk profile in 6 to 12 months. Because of this coronavirus. I mean, we've known that technology was going to be disruptive, but the move away from brick and mortar and the real economy towards the digital economy, towards big data, and the disruptive impacts that have, both in terms of good things, in terms of getting rid of and undermining the power of some of the most sclerotic special interests in advanced industrial societies. That's positive for creating a regulatory environment, a policy environment that can more reflect the 21st century reality. But of course, it also means that lots and lots of people that have already been feeling like their institutions are delegitimized, their social contract doesn't work very well, that they don't know where their opportunities coming from, this coronavirus is landing on their shoulders to a much greater degree. And that's largely not a 2020 risk. That's a 2021, 2022, 2023. Why? Because in 2020, even though governments around the world have been very different in how effectively they've responded to coronavirus, the economic response has been very strong almost around the world. Really, Mexico is the only major economy that's gotten the economic response really wrong. The Europeans, the Japanese, the Americans, the Chinese, the Brazilians, across the board, you've seen pretty strong, consistent economic relief in the short term. But we know that the knock-on economic impact, the social impact, the impact on our political institutions is going to be much, much more structural than that, just as we've experienced in the 10-year hangover from the 2008 financial crisis. And that's where we're going to start to get it wrong. So if we think about the risks that are inherent in this survey and in the analysis that we're putting out now, this is really something that you can prepare yourself over the course of the next coming years. Final point I would make, Gillian, and it comes off what you asked Thomas at the end of the presentation, was you're absolutely right that usually political risk is something that we focus on in the emerging markets. And that's because those political institutions are more vulnerable. They're not as strong. So in an election or in social insurrection or sudden geopolitical challenges, there can be a lot more problems with the ability of those emerging markets to make good on their contracts, on their treaties and the like. Well, what we're seeing is institutional slippage in the developed world. In other words, it's not just that emerging markets don't always emerge. Developed democracies don't always stay developed democracies. And what I would say is that if you look at the institutional stability in the United States, yes, the judiciary and the military are largely as strong and resilient as they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, but the legislature, the mixed media and social media, the executive, the civil service have actually eroded significantly in the last 10 years. That erosion is accelerating. And while the United States is not close to being an authoritarian state, it's actually probably closer as a political system to being a hybrid mixed system than a consolidated democracy in 2020. And that, of course, means that political risk will be coming from the United States to a much greater degree than any of us would have expected 5 or 10 years ago. So if there's a big surprise, maybe intrinsic in this report, maybe it's that.
Well, that's fascinating, Ian, because in fact, full disclosure, I wrote a column at the crack of dawn this morning arguing that financial investors are waking up to this idea that political risk is not an emerging market issue anymore, it's a developed world issue. And frankly, what happened at the start of this week with the debate illustrates that. Quick question before I move forward. Do you think most investors and corporate leaders have the intellectual skill set to analyze this? Because they've grown up in a world where you could basically plug in the numbers from developed countries into a spreadsheet and basically assume that everything worked with a kind of predictable logic.
They clearly have the intellectual skill set, but I'm not sure they have the cultural milieu. In the same way that the foreign policy establishment in the United States is just incapable of thinking outside of the NATO box or the idea that China could be a technology superpower, because for all of their careers, those things weren't true. I think the idea that you and I and Thomas are discussing, that political risk can emanate from the United States in a great way, is just so countercultural to everything we assumed about globalization and free markets. They're moving towards us. We're not the ones that create instability and uncertainty. That's not an intellectual toolbox. That's actually a view of the world that needs to be deeply shaken.
Yeah, well, I must say, I trained as a cultural anthropologist before I became a journalist, and I am fascinated by the systemic and cultural frameworks we create to shape our lives and how they can shift. But I'd like to bring in now Henri Wallard, who's going to talk to us about some of the analysis of the results and put that into the kind of frame that we just heard both Ian and Thomas lay out for us. Over to you, Henri.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to present the results of this investigation. And there are a few things which emerge and will resonate in what I will present with what was just said. In particular, there is this perception of a clear and present danger, which was represented, of course, by the pandemics of COVID-19, but also, as said before, some of the changes in the mix of risk as perceived by the people around the world. So it's a very interesting and rich content. I've selected a certain number of things to present in the short time we have today, but we'll be happy, of course, to take on questions and answer into more details. So briefly, we surveyed a certain number of people in 15 countries online and interviewed experts in 53 countries and combined this information to provide this analysis. A few things have been said already about what the expert delivered in terms of hierarchy of the risk, with the fact that the pandemic came up, and many of the risks just retrograded by one number, second to the third, third to the fourth, etc., with basically the same order. In Europe, though, we can see that the perception of the risk of the climate change remained pretty high and has been a bit different from the other regions of the world. There is also, among all this, the emergence of other risks which are coupled to the pandemics or consequence of the pandemics. They relate to the social unrest, the macroeconomic risk, the geopolitical risk induced by this massive event which we have faced since the beginning of this year and the end of last year. When we talk about risk and the way it's perceived by people, it's not a one-size-fits-all. The men and women speak about the risk in different ways, according to your age, your level of education, and also where you are around the world. And we have just shown here some ideas about the dispersion of how people, consider there are someone who, yes, a lot or yes, a little, would take risk. And, you see that it's not a one-size-fits-all. In the average of the countries we surveyed, you have the numbers, 14 who say yes a lot, and 42, average and yes a few, but this is very different from country to country. So one of the lessons of this, if you want to understand risk, you clearly must have a more granular approach, not think that things are all over the place the same. They are not, and it's a very important first element which supports the idea to measure and investigate this regularly and at the granular level. The opinions about the idea of risk, the idea that zero risk exists is not shared by a large majority of people, and is shared, by the large majority of people, and that people who take risk are more often successful than others is also quite shared. Interestingly, you see that societies and need to progress cannot do this without taking risk is also an interesting element at the bottom of the slide. So there is this feeling that, of course, you disagree with the fact that you can get progress without some risk, and probably meaning disruption as well. On the perception of globalization, once again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. There are some countries, and especially the powerful countries like China and the United States, who are really positive, more positive than others. In return, you see the evidence of some fear and concern by European countries. And in the bottom of the list, you have here Belgium, Italy, France, and Japan, with the lowest score among the countries we explored. Regarding the level of vulnerability of populations around the world compared to 5 years ago, and you will see at the end of the presentation something which are compared to last year with the impact of COVID, we have a special section of this. The feeling of vulnerability has gone up and reached really extreme levels. And you see that you are vulnerable, you have a perception of vulnerability, increased vulnerability, everywhere, whether it's your perception of the world, which is more vulnerable, your country, your continent, your city, your village, different degrees, but it's spread all across the space around yourself where you see an increase in vulnerability. This is a little more rich and dense in terms of information, but it gives some interesting highlight. First emerge the clear and present danger I mentioned at the beginning, of course, the pandemic, the COVID. Here you have the level of, the measurement of different risks across all the countries we surveyed. But what distinguishes these different risks is whether it is already having an impact or will have an impact very soon within 5 years or longer term impact. Of course, the epidemic clearly is a clear and present danger. And there is a way to put into context, the different ranking and the retrogradation in a way of the climate change. It's still seen as a danger, but a danger which will have a more long-lasting effect, more lengthy time to really materialize and impact everyone's life. So there is a majority of people who consider, more than 50% that it's already having an impact, the pandemics for sure, the pollution, the risk of social conflicts, the cyber risks, and also the climate change, but with this more lengthy tail of impact along the way moving forward. Some of these other risks are listed, but more lengthy, at least 5 years by the majority of the population. If we look at some clusters and countries regarding risks, here we see a certain number of emerging factors, and it resonates with what was said before on the distinction between emerging market and mature developed markets. I want to flag, for instance, the number we have on the United States on social discontent and local conflicts. And clearly, it's not a surprise with what you said and other measurements we can make on how polarized, more polarized than before the American society can be. So yes, we see some indexes of everyone getting very worried, of course, about the pandemics and that it has an impact, but also some other topics and other sources of risks. The climate change, which has some variation, which we recognize according to the countries, but social discontent and local conflicts is not, just emerging markets. It also appears, and I've put a red circle around it, if you look at the case of France itself. How do you get protected against risk? This is an interesting one because it can be seen as a contradiction with the dispersion around globalization, whether it's a risk or not, it's a threat or not. Very clearly, people expect all over the place a response at the global level. When facing emergent risks, a global answer is seen as important by all these people, and also at the country level. But the level of the continent and the level of city appear basically irrelevant when facing the emergent risks. Who can I trust? Who can I rely on when I'm facing significant troubles? And in some countries, it's more pronounced than others, but basically the family and my savings, and less so, especially in some very liberal countries, the country system or even my private insurance. And here you see the dispersion across countries, and you have a certain number of distinctions which emerge, where you see, for instance, that in China, you have a high level of perception of protection all over the place, the family, my own resources, the country's welfare, my private insurance, while in some other countries, if you look, for instance, at Spain and Italy, it's basically the family, the family, the family. So, the last mile, what about the COVID? Which is, of course, it's not even an event, it's so massive, it's a historical circumstance. And here we looked at some evolution compared to 1 year ago. It's contrasted. Of course, there is undeniably, since 1 year, a deterioration of the situation which is felt by many people. However, the risk of being seriously sick, for instance, much more, 19%. Well, this is high, but this is not so high. The risk of other things happening, losing my job, getting in precarity, risk of dying, risk of family-related difficulties, combination, they all, move together, different levels, but there is clearly, of course, and we can measure this, real deterioration in the perception of risk as felt by many people. On personal attitudes, and this is one I wanted to focus a little bit at the end of this presentation. The survey is, in a certain way, a denial of the fact that everything would get all over the place. Yes, there are some changes, and we can see that, but it's not like a massive, 60% would be totally more mindful of my health. 37% is very high, it's very important, but it's not like a massive switch all over the place. And you can see this in different indexes. So 20% say that they would totally change their habit to reduce the impact of the environment, and that's what they say. It does not mean that it is exactly what people will do in the future. It's a way to measure their opinions and what people think they will do. There will be another process to really translate this into action. So there is undeniably an increased level of fear. There is the intention to change for a certain number of people, but it is far from the radical, all over the place revolution, transformation, like a new world from A to B, which some people have written about and thought about. So this is what I wanted to share with you today on this situation. Things are changing. They are not all over the place the same. They will continue to change. Stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Henri. And I'm going to turn now to Renaud and Sally. But before I do, very quick question about the data, Henri. How did you actually reach people at a time of COVID and lockdown? Did you have to rely on telephone surveys this year? I'm just curious.
First, it's our job. We do this all the time. We have different ways to reach out to people. For this program, we reach out to people online. So online has actually boomed during the COVID. I think in this office where we are at AXA headquarters, lots of people have used different systems to do remote working, to be able to have meetings online like we have today. So it was not too difficult to execute this program online.
Right.
But I just want to say, because you mentioned telephone and other methods, we have adapted also our method to reach out to people. We have some contactless process to actually be able to dispatch products to people, like when you deliver a product to some people so that they want to test the product. So our company has adapted itself big time, of course, to the situation of COVID. In that case, it was not too difficult because it was online, but you can do this in many other methods of data collection, provided you take the social distancing and the necessary carefulness to reach out to people.
Right. Well, that is absolutely fascinating. Thank you. So we're going to hear from Renaud Guidet and Sally Wan about how they see these results. So over to the next part of the program.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Gillian. Now to discuss health risks. In the 2019 edition of AXA's Future Risks reports, we had noted that health risks were under the radar. Among these, however, pandemics and infectious diseases made the cut to the list of top 10 risks, but ranking only number 8. And late last year, when we started exploring ideas for the 2020 edition, we thought pandemics should be top of mind. Unfortunately, reality has caught up with our expectations. And this is reflected in our survey with the contributing experts now seeing pandemics and infectious diseases as the greatest threat to our society. It's not only a matter for experts. The public opinion at large is very much in line, ranking health risks as their major cause for vulnerability. Having health risks topping the charts shows a reprioritization. We focus on protecting what matters. We have seen a clear willingness to do whatever it takes to save human lives. Health takes precedence over immediate GDP growth, as was evidenced earlier in the year when governments across the world took unprecedented lockdown decisions. The reweighting of health in the list of our priorities as a society also impacts how we balance it with other risks. And interestingly enough, our contributing experts have downgraded the risks related to medical innovation from number 12 to number 22, which may suggest, at least for now, a greater acceptance in principle to run these risks if this is the price to pay for better health. More broadly, the risks related to technological progress seem to be shifting to the background. For instance, AI risk has moved from number 6 to number 12. And the ethical risk that comes from the use of technology is mentioned by experts only in 14th position in the list of top risks. We believe our role is also to raise awareness on weak signals and overlooked trends. And just like last year, we had flagged pandemics as an under-the-radar risk, which could cause massive disruption, not only to health systems, but also to supply chains and to businesses. This year, we believe that mental health has been overshadowed and would deserve a greater focus, especially in the aftermath of COVID-19. We at AXA have been working and leading the charge for long on mental health. The concrete initiatives we have been taking on the ground are as relevant as ever in the current environment. So I would like Sally Wan, who is CEO of AXA Hong Kong, to walk you through this. On to you, Sally.
Thank you, Renaud. So clearly, we see the mental health trend has a unique place now, in a unique trend in this part of the world. According to our AXA Wellness Program and Index, we have surveyed respondents in Hong Kong, Macau, and mainland Greater Bay Area, and they considered mental well-being is the most important wellness dimension. This factor was previously only ranked 3rd and 4th on the list, but this year, it surpassed financial well-being to become the most important factor affecting the public wellness. Let me call out a few highlights from the index. Actually, stress is the key issue in the whole region, with work and education being the key sources of stress. Workplace stress is the highest in Hong Kong. Almost 1 in 4 claimed that they were suffering from mental health issues. However, almost 40% are saying that they're not going to discuss the problem with their employers because the fear of affecting promotion. Technology also brings a number of concerns of the working class, including long hours working and worry that they are being replaced by technology. Clearly, high workplace stress is an issue in Hong Kong, but only 20% of the working class find enough support from their employers. Mental health is not an independent risk. It has an immense impact on our society and economy. The World Economic Forum has estimated that mental health problems could cost in economic losses worldwide by 2030. So we have anticipated this risk early and have already taken some actions to support our community. Last year, we launched a dedicated employees' mental health program for our corporate customers. The My Health program provides comprehensive end-to-end mental health support in 3 aspects: education to raise awareness, prevention for stress, and also treatment. Also in July this year, we also launched AXA Better Me, a holistic platform with 20 health services to support body and mind health of individual customers. We also opened 2 very useful features free of charge for general public, including Symptom Checker and Mind Charger. Mind Charger is a mindfulness meditation tool on our mobile app. Everyone can access daily to practice mindfulness. Lastly, we want to use different creative ways to raise awareness of the mental health issue and to reduce stigma in our society. So we will be hosting a live chat similar to this one on our Facebook on the 10th of October, World Mental Health Day. We have invited celebrities from different arenas and also medical professionals from different hospitals and renowned medical care center to discuss common emotional conditions in an interactive way and light-hearted way so that we can attract attention from the society.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm curious, are you seeing a similar pattern of reticence to talk about these issues in Europe and the US as well?
Yes, definitely. I think we highlighted the Asian example, which is a good case in point of what AXA has been doing. But more broadly, we can see an interconnectedness, which Thomas was alluding alluding to earlier, which means that indeed what we're seeing in Asia very much applies to Europe and to the US as well.
Right. I must say I find this fascinating because very few CEOs are talking up about this. I mean, Bernard Looney of British Petroleum is one of the few, but I suspect this is going to be an increasing issue over the next year as we look to the future. And it will require perhaps a change of mentality, not just in the corporate boards, but also amongst people analyzing risk going forward. But having talked about that, I'd like to turn now to the issue of climate change, which has moved from being the top ranked risk to number 2. Thomas Buberl said earlier that he thought that was a temporary switch. But Ulrike, can you tell us how and why the issue of climate change needs to be watched and where you think that's going within the risk ecosystem?
Yes, Gillian, thank you very much. And obviously, this was, of course, one of the most interesting findings we had. Climate change had been top of the rank since 2015. That's a number of years. Obviously, it's understandable that under the current circumstances and given the magnitude of the crisis, pandemics would take over. Nevertheless, and I will speak briefly a bit about our journey on the fight against climate change. Our concern with this is that being overshadowed means probably maybe a drop in awareness and a drop in action, and this is simply something that entails a risk of its own. What we need to say as well is that the survey found regional differences, which are very interesting, and I will let Jerry, who is much more a specialist of this aspect of the question than me, but you see that in Europe, countries like Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, even the UK still rank climate change as the number 1. So this reflects really how climate change has really made it to the top of the corporate agenda, but also of the political agenda. And if you look at the recovery plans that are implemented in Europe, you clearly see that they have an aim of accelerating the transition to a low carbon economy. So being so high on the agenda probably explains why in Europe this drop didn't happen. In the US, in North America more specifically, the drop was significant. We went from 75 or 76% of experts ranking it number 1 to 45, 46, so that's a drastic drop. And this is obviously worrying when you see the efforts that need to be done by the North American economies to contribute to tackling global warming. And if you look Asia, it's also interesting because at the very low range, countries who rank climate change really at the bottom range, you see some of the countries who will actually be most affected, such as Indonesia, the Philippines, or Thailand. So this is a bit of the complex picture we have. Why is this worrying to us? Very simply because as insurers, what we see right now, and it's not in 5 to 10 years, is already an impact on the economy, on societies of climate change. We see it obviously in our business through an acceleration of extreme weather events, flooding, fires, and extreme heat waves. It's here. It's, as you say, a clear and present danger. So obviously seeing how long it will take us, and a lot of the corporate commitments that you see nowadays are targeting 2050, but require an amplitude of efforts where you really simply cannot imagine losing 1 or 2 years on that journey. On our side, our journey has started in 2015 with very strong measures on exiting coal. So, we've been accelerating that exit, and we will be on our investment portfolios and on our underwriting out of coal producing companies as soon as 2030. We have doubled every 2 or 3 years our green investments and are targeting 24 billion euros in green investments by 2023. And we are creating new tools such as transition bonds to finance maybe sectors which are not yet totally green, but who need the funding to get there. And what we see, to come back to our I would say, level of concern, is that even with those strong efforts, it's taking a lot of time to move the needle. We measure the warming of our own investment portfolio every year. So we are happy with the results, but it's very slow. So if you have 2 or 3 years where people have another agenda, you can imagine that getting to 1.5 degrees in 2050, which is our commitment is going to be very difficult. And one last point, coming back to the interconnectedness that we mentioned and the complexity of the risks, what we also have learned in this journey is that you need cooperation between different sectors. You need cooperation with the public sector. You need to be together in this. And I think also on the preparedness, the respondents gave some answers that could be worrying on how they assess the preparedness of public and also the private sector to those responses. So we have to show the signal very quickly that we have solutions and that we can move forward. So in a nutshell, that's our comments from the AXA's point of view.
Well, thank you very much. And I must say, I think the points you make about the degree of focus this is now attracting in some corporate boards, not all, and the fact the conversation has moved from the why to the how is fascinating. About a year ago, I created at the Financial Times a platform called Moral Money, which is covering these issues on a day in, day out basis. And then we have a lot to write about. But there's also still a lot of challenges and roadblocks. And I think that the way you've highlighted it is quite sobering and should concentrate minds. But I'd like to throw now to Jerry to ask him to say, from his perspective, how he sees the climate risks and the wider messages of this risk report.
Well, thanks very much, Gillian. I think I can understand the anxiety that people feel when they see climate go from the top risk, which everybody had been speaking about for years, down to number 2. But I'd want to start by saying an alternative reading of the Ipsos report is it's amazing that climate has stayed at the forefront of people's attention at a time when our lives are being overrun by news about the virus. There's very immediate concern, and rightly so, about it affecting us personally, health-wise, affecting our families. Here in Canada, it's closing our schools. So it's really impressive that climate has stayed where it is on the risk profile. And I think that Thomas is right when he says that this is a temporary diminishment of climate, that it's going to come back with a vengeance. I think in the United States in particular, you're seeing in the context of the presidential election campaign, that you have one candidate campaigning on a climate plan that's so aggressive, it would have been unimaginable one electoral cycle ago. So Joe Biden, for instance, is campaigning on a $2 trillion plan to decarbonize the entire United States electricity sector. That would have been the pipe dream of the most aggressive climate activists in the United States just 5-10 years ago. So from my point of view, I think that as someone who has been working on climate in a variety of capacities for about 20 years now, it makes me feel old to put it that way, a lot of very important structural changes have happened really quickly. I'd like to compliment AXA and the insurance industry in general for being amongst the first pure economic actors to see this issue for what it was, which is an unmitigated exogenous risk to the economic and financial system that somehow had to be brought in and absorbed. And it's an interesting type of risk, because mostly when we think of risk, we think of things that might happen. When it comes to climate change, it's not something that might happen, it's something that is happen and is certain to accelerate. So the scientists who projected changes in the climate have often been picked on for being wrong at the margins. But it's important not to miss the big picture, which is that they've been right about all of the big things. Australia was on fire in January in the same way that California is on fire right now. And the insurance industry, which fundamentally looks forward and tries to understand what's going to cause risk to its clients and to the broader economic system as a whole, has been amongst the first sounding the alarm bell that climate change isn't something that just environmental activists and traditional actors should be worried about, but it's a core risk to the financial system, and it's a core risk to the stability of the global economy. So I think we're seeing these risks manifested now. The good news is, and I'd like to end on an optimistic note because there's a lot of gloom and doom about climate change, the very good news is that the responses, whether or not they're commensurate with the changes we're seeing, are accelerating at a very rapid pace. So when you look forward a little bit into the future, look at 2021, which will be a very consequential year when it comes to climate change. The COP26 process, you see major actors like China. Just last week in New York, Xi Jinping made an announcement at the UNGA that took everybody by surprise. He said that China's going to be a net zero economy by the middle of the century, and that its emissions will peak sometime in 2030. So while it is true that from the apprehensive, and you feel this in the apprehensiveness of the survey, it is true that in certain important regions like North America and China and Asia, that because of the pandemic, because of the immediate threats of COVID, climate change has slipped slightly down the radar screen. I have every confidence that this is not going away, and economic actors, political actors, their efforts to react to it in a way that's commensurate with the crisis is accelerating. And 2021 is a telltale year. One of my favorite, I'll end with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite American authors. Flannery O'Connor once said that the truth doesn't change according to our ability to stomach it. And we are seeing the truth of climate change being made manifest around us everywhere we look on a daily basis. And I think that economic actors, political actors, and multilateral institutions are accelerating their efforts to respond in a commensurate way.
Well, that's fascinating, Jerry. Thank you. And I must say, in our own small way at the Financial Times with our Moral Money platform, which if anyone's interested in tracking these issues, do please follow and log on to. We're seeing an astonishing level of engagement amongst the Financial Times audience in these issues. And I have to be honest and say, when COVID happened earlier this year, I actually thought, well, maybe we launched Moral Money at the wrong time and people are going to stop caring about this because they're too busy just surviving. And we've seen quite the contrary, an explosion in engagement and, interest amongst the Financial Times readers, which have taken it way off the chart. It's been, probably our most successful new product we've ever launched, which is frankly quite surprising for me. So it's a very interesting moment. And I tend to think that one thing that's happened is that COVID-19 has shown us three things which matter for climate. One, we linked in a very interlinked planet, where when the weakest link, chain in the link breaks, we all suffer. Secondly, you can't ignore science or you suffer. And thirdly, changes in social behavior, which once seemed unimaginable, can sometimes happen. And if even grumpy, aggressive New Yorkers can wear masks, which everyone's doing right now in New York, extraordinary things can happen. But anyway, we are running short of time. So I want to quickly turn to both Thomas and Ian to ask if they have any final reflections from what we've heard to really leave us on a note that enables us to crystallize this discussion.
Perhaps. I'll kick it off with the final word, Thomas. You're absolutely right, Gillian. These sorts of times can create changes in behavior no one would have expected. I was talking to the Greek Prime Minister just a couple of days ago, seen as the country that was most shiftless and lazy 10 years ago, and now seen as the country doing the most to respond effectively and quickly, and teaching 4-year-olds how to wear masks. Do they all get it right all the time? No, but it's enough so that they don't have the spread in the schools that they do in the United States right now. We can learn. And I think that as disruptive as this report is, and as much as people are getting whipsawed by what's happening in the world around them right now, and it's reflected in all the data we're talking about today, we all knew that the trends that we were on before this pandemic were unsustainable. The geopolitical trends, the economics trends, the way that we were governed, we knew it. And that's why we got Trump. It's why you've gotten so much polarization inside the US. It's Brexit, it's the Gillian in France, it's all over the world. And I'm not pretending that coronavirus is suddenly going to fix that. We know that geopolitically, the world is actually becoming more fragmented. There's a decoupling going on between the US and China and tech. We didn't get to talk to today, but we will going forward. But we also know that this level of disruption will create a level of change in the way we respond to climate, a level of change in that the ex-post environment will not be what it was before. People keep asking, well, when do we get back to normal? And the thing about a depression is not that it destroys society. It's rather that the way that you behave afterwards is different than the way you behaved before. The structural changes are permanent. And that is truly the seed from which all optimism springs from this report, and something that I think is going to keep all of us very exercised for many, many years to come.
Right. Well, I think that's a great note to put on. And heavens only knows we need a bit of optimism now, particularly anyone who sat and watched the debate in America early this week. But I'm going to give the last word now to Thomas. And I will say, by the way, we've had two terrifically good questions from the audience. One is, the report highlights a notable gap in the perception of climate change risk between Europe and the rest of the world. Why, and what can we do to address that? In fact, we just heard some of those thoughts from Jerry. I would say the election is going to be the most important thing, but Thomas, you may want to mention that briefly. And the second thing is a question from Louis. People tend to assume that mental health is an issue that only the mental health industry should consider and be responsible for. Do you think that other stakeholders should play a role in minimizing this as well? Again, this has been partly addressed in the conversation, but I thank you for asking these questions. And Thomas, you may wish to address that. But anyway, Thomas, the floor is yours for the final closing words and any other thoughts you'd like to share about those questions or anything else.
Thank you, Gillian, for the great moderation, and thanks to my colleagues at Eurasia, at Ipsos and at AXA for really having contributed to this great report. We have a very clear view now what doesn't work and where are the risks. And it is normal that you have geographical differences, that Europe is maybe a little bit ahead in terms of its awareness on climate than other countries. But I'm personally not worried about this. This is something that will come out over time. I think this massive disruption of COVID-19 has really woken us up and has shown us that it's now time to act, because we've discussed for a long time. We've seen now within 7 years that risks, yes, have moved slightly, but essentially the message has remained very similar. And so when it's time to act, we need to ask ourselves as well, what can we do? Because often we find many excuses why things don't work, why there is geopolitical tension and we can't do things. I do believe there is a lot in our own hands to do it. And it comes to how do we work together between public and private? How can we contribute, for example, as individuals, as companies, for legislation to be more agile, to be faster? How can we as individuals and corporates contribute much more to the phenomenon of climate transition, not in a way that we continue to write checks like we used to do in our corporate social responsibility programs, but that sustainability, and in particular being an actor in society, becomes a core part of strategies of companies. I'm personally very grateful for this insight and very positive and optimistic that we have a lot of burning platforms, a lot of urgency now to act. And I really hope that we take this wave across all countries to make sure that we, A, engage ourselves in what is necessary, but also make sure that we do not forget the aspect of solidarity. Mental health, Gillian, as you mentioned, is very much linked as well. How can we help each other to get to this new normal? How can we bridge the gap? And how can we make sure that we gain back more certainty and more confidence in our future? And I think that is a task that we have to work on together, and we can all contribute to it, and we should do as much as we can to really make a difference for our future and for tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all the guests. I found this a fascinating discussion, both as a journalist who writes a lot about financial, political, economic risk, and also as a cultural anthropologist who's fascinated with how the world is changing, particularly in these astonishing times. As Ian says, depressions, shocks, crises, breakpoints are terrifying, but they can also be exciting moments of transition. And they can be moments when risk is not just a 4-letter word, to use the English tag, but it can also be a 4-letter word that can translate into hope in some unexpected ways as well. Anyway, so it remains for me to say a big thank you to everyone for listening. And I would like to basically hand over to Thomas for the very last thank you and good luck perhaps to everyone watching. Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much, Gillian. It was great to be with you today. Thanks again for your brilliant moderation. It is not always easy to capture such a very complex and important topic. Thanks to our colleagues from Eurasia, from Ipsos, and also thanks to all the AXA colleagues. I really hope this report gives us the necessary power and energy to act on it, but also to make sure that we continue to follow up what is happening next year, because there are many risks on the rise that are appearing at the 5th and 6th position. So I wish you a lot of energy, a lot of mental strength, and a lot of solidarity in this next phase, which will be very important. Thank you very much.